Hey, everybody, and welcome to another deep dive. Sometimes things get complicated, and today's one of those days. We're looking at education in Pennsylvania specifically. This idea that the push for social justice might actually be backfiring and leading to folks pushing back against DEI policies.
Yeah, it's definitely a hot topic.
It is. And we've got a whole stack of articles here with all sorts of different perspectives. So let's jump in and see if we can unpack this a little bit.
Sounds good.
It's kind of like, you know how a pendulum swings one way then the other?
Yeah.
Maybe that's what we're seeing here with this whole social justice thing.
Yeah.
Push too hard in one direction and boom, you get a reaction in the opposite direction.
Yeah, you could say that. It's like an overcorrection.
And we're seeing some pretty alarming stuff when it comes to student performance in Pennsylvania.
Oh, really?
Yeah. The 2024 PSSA scores, only 53% of students are proficient in reading and writing,
Wow.
and only 40% in math.
That's pretty low.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
And it makes you wonder, where are all the resources going if kids are struggling with these basic skills?
Right. You'd think that would be the priority.
Well, one article points to this $350,000 grant that went to the Center for Black Educator Development, CBED for short.
Okay.
And get this, it was specifically for racial justice initiatives. And it was funded by COVID relief funds.
COVID relief funds for racial justice. That's interesting.
Yeah, a little strange, right?
Yeah.
So what is this CBED all about?
So they're all about educational equity, but they say you can't have that without racial justice.
Mhm.
And their founder, Sharif El-Mekki, he's a pretty big deal.
Yeah, he's even an advisor to Governor Shapiro.
Exactly. He's got a lot of influence.
Now, El-Mekki's a bit of a controversial figure too, right?
Yeah, a bit.
I mean, besides advising the governor, he's also on record supporting school segregation, has ties to the Black Panther Party, and even created this guide advocating for children of color to be taught only by teachers of color.
You've definitely been doing your research.
You've got to be prepared, right?
For sure. And
Yeah.
then, it's important to say that a lot of folks think increasing teacher diversity is a good thing. But with El-Mekki, it's like his main focus is on ideology instead of, actual academic results.
Yeah, and then there are these quotes from one of the articles. Teaching is activism. Liberate education.
Whoa.
Yeah, I know, right? Pretty strong stuff.
Really makes you think, if you were a parent in Pennsylvania, what would liberating education even mean to you? Like, would that be what you want for your kids' education?
It's a good question.
Mm.
And it kind of makes you wonder, is the goal of education to just teach kids facts and skills?
Right.
Or is it also supposed to be about, social change?
It's a big question for sure.
It also makes me wonder about that $350,000 grant.
Yeah.
What were they hoping to achieve with that money?
That's a great question, and that's where things get kind of fuzzy.
Fuzzy. How so?
Well, the grant goals, at least the ones that were reported, they're super vague. Like, they talk about gains in early literacy, but there's no specific targets, no way to measure it. And then there's stuff like increases in positive racial identity. How do you even measure that?
Yeah, that's a tough one.
And the whole thing just doesn't seem connected to improving those core skills, reading, writing, math.
Yeah.
The ones we saw tanking in those PSSE scores.
So we've got low test scores, we've got questionable spending, and this focus on social justice that might be taking away from academics.
Mm-hmm.
What happened next? Did Pennsylvanians just stand by and watch?
Actually, no. Turns out a bunch of school districts, mostly out in the western part of the state, they weren't too thrilled about this whole thing.
Okay.
Yeah. They actually went and filed a lawsuit against the Pennsylvania Department of Education.
Well, what for?
So they were challenging these guidelines called Culturally Relevant and Sustaining Education, or CRSE for short.
CRC. Okay.
And a lot of people, especially those who were part of this lawsuit, they called these guidelines woke. They thought it was like forcing some kind of ideology on kids.
So what exactly did these CRSE guidelines say?
Well, it wasn't just about teaching, history, math, and all that. These guidelines actually told teachers they had to talk about things like microaggressions in the classroom. Yeah, and they had to, challenge their own biases and even become advocates for changing school policies.
That does sound like a pretty big change for teachers.
Right. So anyway, the lawsuit, those Western Pennsylvania districts actually won.
They did.
Yeah, the Department of Education had to get rid of those CRSE guidelines.
Wow. So they're totally gone.
Well, not completely. They came up with something new called the Common Ground Framework.
What's that all about?
So it's much more relaxed, more like suggestions than actual rules.
So they kind of tone things down a bit.
Exactly.
Yeah.
This new framework is more about understanding where students are coming from, their different backgrounds and experiences.
Makes sense. So are schools using this common ground framework now?
It's kind of a mixed bag, which is
Ah,
pretty interesting.
how so?
Well, some districts, especially in those more conservative areas, they've totally ditched the old CRSE approach. They're all about going back to basics, focusing on those core subjects.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense since they were the ones who filed the lawsuit in the first place.
Right. But here's the thing. A lot of districts in the more liberal parts of the state, they're actually sticking with those old CRSE guidelines.
Even though they don't have to.
Yeah, they still see value in those DEI principles. They think it's important for their students.
So even though the state backed off, those DEI efforts are still happening in a lot of places.
Yeah.
Seems like this isn't going away anytime soon.
Yep. And it just shows you how much power local communities have when it comes to education.
Yeah, even if the state makes a rule, individual schools and districts can still do their own thing.
Exactly.
Which kind of brings us back to that question we started with, is all this focus on social justice actually backfiring?
Well, the answer is it's complicated. There are people who think this push for equity and inclusion is a good thing, but then there are others who are worried about what might happen if it goes too far.
Like, will it actually hurt students' education?
Right. Some people are afraid that all this focus on DEI might take attention away from the things kids need to learn, especially when they're already struggling with reading, writing, and math.
Yeah, and then there's the whole issue of people feeling like their values aren't being respected.
Exactly. It's like that pendulum we were talking about. Push too hard one way, and you're bound to get a pushback in the other direction.
So how do you find that balance?
That's the million-dollar question, right? How do you promote equality and inclusion without sacrificing academics or alienating a big chunk of the community? It's a tough one.
Sounds like it. So where do we go from here?
It's hard to say, but I think we need to be having these conversations. We need to listen to each other, try to understand where everyone's coming from, and be willing to compromise.
It all comes down to the purpose of education.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. What are we really trying to do with education? Is it about giving kids the knowledge and skills they need to succeed? Or is it more about shaping their beliefs and values?
Yeah, it really feels like we're stuck between a rock and a hard place. You got folks who are really passionate about this push for equity and inclusion. But then you got others who are like, hold on, what about the basics? It's tough.
It is, and that's what makes this whole thing so tricky. There are no easy answers here. It's going to take a lot of talking and listening to figure out how to move forward.
Yeah, we got to understand where everyone's coming from, right?
Absolutely. And we got to be willing to meet in the middle, find some common ground.
And this deep dive, it's really just the beginning, We've only scratched the surface of this whole thing.
Yeah, there's so much more to explore. It's a super complex issue.
So we encourage you to keep digging. Take a look at the articles we talked about today. Do some research on your own. Talk to your friends and family about it.
Yeah, what do you think about all this? What parts make sense to you? What parts worry you?
We'd love to hear your thoughts. Keep this conversation going.
Because at the end of the day, this is about our kids and the kind of education we want for them.
That's what it all boils down to. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time. Keep asking those tough questions and keep those minds engaged.